Now, the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transportation, we as an organization, we are an international professional body for those involved in logistics, supply, and transport. We were established in the UK in 1990, operating in Australia since 1935. So it's what is one of the oldest industry bodies for logistics and transportations in the world today. CILT International Network has about 35,000 members and 200 key corporations working in 100 countries. So it's a global network, just like logistics and supply chains are. It was granted Royal Charter in 1926, and the patron is the Princess Royal for the Chartered Institute. We have an upcoming seminar that I just want to draw attention before we move on. This is on data analytics for transport and logistics decision making, which is on the 9th of May at 6 p.m. So we have a partner and a director from Deloitte providing this seminar, which is hosted by Genevieve, who's the Women in Logistics and Transportation Chair of the Chartered Institute. So please, if you have nothing else to do, please join in for this seminar as well on the 9th of May at 6 p.m. The other thing is Academy Global, in partnership with the Chartered Institute, hosts a study center. And the study center for CILT gives out degrees. And in this one here, we have a short course that we're currently enrolling in, which is the CILT International Short Course on Supply Chain Project Management, which enables you to analyze supply chain management issues and then identify project plans in order to tackle those systemic issues or the systemic nature of those issues. So you're going to learn tools and techniques that you can take over and easily apply in real world settings. So it's highly pragmatic and is reflective learning based on your own working environment. And this starts on the 13th of May. Now, this is just a bit of background around the Chartered Institute and Logistics and Transportation, but it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you today Professor David Levinson from the University of Sydney, who started his academic journey at the University of Minnesota in 2017 as a foundation professor in transport engineering. He conducts research on accessibility, transport economics, transport network evolution, and transport and land use interaction. He's a founding editor of the Journal of Transport and Land Use and of Findings. He has authored several books, including The Transportation Experience, Planning for Place and Plexus, The 30-Minute City, A Political Economy of Access, Elements of Access, and the End of Traffic and the Future of Access. He writes at transportist.net. So you can follow more of his work on that website. With that, I'll happily hand over the speaker to Professor David Levinson. Thanks for making time today and a warm welcome from us.
Great, thank you for inviting me. And hopefully you see my screen.
Yep.
And you see the screen change. Yep. All right. So I'm going to be talking about the 30-minute city. The 30-minute city is an idea that has been around in planning for the better part of half a decade. And the idea fundamentally is an idea about accessibility. And access is about opportunity, how many things you can reach. So the question is, what do modern people care about? Reaching jobs, reaching shops and stores, reaching various types of amenities like parks and recreational facilities and so on, healthcare, reaching the outside world through places like airports in Australian cities, and intercity train stations. And we measure this with isochrones. And so this is a map of an isochrone that was drawn in 1923, restored by Cam Gordon a few years ago, showing how much area could be reached within 0 to 10 minutes in purple or up to 50 to 60 minutes in yellow in Melbourne, in 1923 by trains and by trams. And you can see this is in the pre-geographic information system era. So everything is nice and perfectly circular. They had compass tools and so on to draw this. But you see the basic idea, the closer you are, the more reachable you are to the center of activity. And the closer you are to a station, the more likely that you can get to the center in a shorter period of time because you have less access costs. And so accessibility, the elevator talk that we give, or the lift talk, I guess is, I should say, in the Southern Hemisphere, how many things you can reach in a given amount of time. And the reason we have elevator talks is because we often have a short amount of time with a leading decision maker, a politician, and so on. And what can you explain to them in 8 seconds? And I think this is a concept you can explain to them in a few seconds you have with them while you're on the lift. How many jobs or workers can be reached in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes by car, public transport, carpool, walking, bike, truck, scooter, Segway, so on, at different times of day? Now, the problem with this measure, or a feature of this measure, is there are many different types of activities, many different time thresholds we can consider, many different modes, and of course, many different times of day. So if you wanted to be exhaustive about it, just using these definitions, you'd have 622,000 different calculations, probably more than we really want to use. So we're going to focus on access to jobs, access to labor, but you can do studies of access to anything, and they're all informative, and they tend to be correlated with each other. So another way of thinking about this visually, imagine you're at the white dot. How many red dots can you reach in a given amount of time? Well, if our blue circle is 10 minutes, you can't reach any of them. And in 20 minutes, you can reach 2 of them. And in 30 minutes, you can reach 3 of them. So that's how many opportunities you can reach. And what we're trying to do is measure this for every white dot in the region. Basically, you could think of this in the Australian census, mesh block definition of space, every mesh block in the region. The advantage of this is it's a count of destinations reachable within a threshold, which is something people can understand. They can verify it. So it's a real thing, not just an index. We can explain it as 30-minute access to 10,000 jobs or whatever the number happens to be. And of course, we can have multiple metrics, different destination types, different maps, and we can understand them all and be able to compare them. And we can compare the same place across time, and we compare different places and be able to compare them directly as opposed to other measures which are more complicated. So just as an example, looking at this in Sydney, where I'm based, this is from the Access Across Australia study we did in 2018. In the study, we looked at all of the Australian capital cities. We also have an Access Across New Zealand study where we looked at the major cities in New Zealand, I think came out in 2019. So you can see the maps for all of these areas. And as you can see, jobs within 30 minutes by walking, it's higher in the Sydney CBD, which is what you would expect. And it lowers as you get farther away from the center. All right, not terribly surprising, but we can then use it to compare with riding a bike, and this is assuming you're willing to ride a bike anywhere where riding a bike is legal. Okay, so any public street, excluding motorways, and so on. And obviously, you can get much farther because bicycles go faster than walking generally. Now, you could look at, and we haven't done this here, but we've done it in other cities. Look at what would the biking accessibility be if you could only bike on links that had low speeds or separated and protected bike lanes, and then you would see the difference in the bicycle accessibility compared to the complete network. And compared to public transport, you can see biking gives you actually more access than public transport, and of course driving, which gives you more access than all of those. And in driving, you can see the patterns of where the jobs are distributed in Greater Sydney, as well as where the transport links are. But it's highest in the CBD and in the industrial areas just between Sydney CBD and Sydney Airport. So the 30-minute city idea is featured in plans that the Greater Sydney Commission, rest in peace, put out a few years ago called A Metropolis of Three Cities. It was headed by Lucy Turnbull, who was head of the Greater Sydney Commission, had been on the City of Sydney City Council and as a council member, and of course was married to someone who happened to be prime minister for a short period of time. And they divided the greater region into 3 cities, and they used an accessibility concept of the 30-minute city. And they have different definitions in different parts of the text. I don't think they operationalized it as clearly as they could have. But most residents in each city, that is, each of these 3 clusters, the Western city, the Central city, the Eastern city, can access their metropolitan center or cluster within 30 minutes by public transport or public and active transport. And so that's the idea. Not that you can get anywhere in Greater Sydney within 30 minutes by public transport, because that's basically infeasible. And we can see why today's public transport commute in Sydney is, let's say today's 2016, but it's probably pretty similar to today, was 62 minutes compared to an average commute of 26 minutes by car. And there's a few reasons for that. One is buses are slower than cars and more circuitous, and trains don't go everywhere, but also people who have long trips are more likely to take public transport than they are to take a car. So there's some self-selection going on as well. And if you live in the inner part of the city, your commutes are shorter than if you live in outer Sydney, where your mass transit commutes might be up to 80 minutes, which is a significant amount of time and very far from ever being able to achieve a 30-minute city if you want to be able to live in Western Sydney and get to the Sydney CBD. Now, another concept that's popped up in the last few years, well, there's the 15-minute city concept and the 15-minute neighborhood. So the idea of the 15-minute neighborhood is take out the jobs and you can think about the rest of your daily life. Can you reach those within a 15-minute one-way walk from your home? And many people live within 15-minute walk of a shopping village where they can get to some shops and restaurants. There may be primary and high schools nearby, their GP, parks, swimming pools, a transport hub, so maybe a train station or a busway station, libraries, and other facilities. And this seems like a very pleasant idea. It has been a planning concept, the neighborhood unit, for more than a century now. The 15-minute neighborhood is sort of a rebranding of it and putting it into a temporal context rather than sort of a vaguer context. And we can visualize it and think about, we can reach all of these things within the neighborhood and stay within our neighborhood for everything except commuting. Now, the French have an idea of a 15-minute city, which is sort of implies that you can actually get to your job within 15 minutes as well. I'm a little bit skeptical of that because it sort of begs the question of why live in a metropolitan area at all if you're not going to be traveling beyond a 15-minute area of where you happen to live. So the whole point of the metropolitan area is that you can reach things outside of your neighborhood. So the pint of milk test has also been bandied about. This is discussed in the UK. Can you purchase a pint of milk within a 10-minute walk of your home? The American version, can you purchase a pint of milk within a 10-minute walk of a home at a place that doesn't also sell gasoline? The New Zealand version, can you purchase a pint of ale within a 10-minute walk of your home? So there's various variations on this. Melbourne, of course, being difficult, makes it a 20-minute neighborhood, which is really a 10-minute neighborhood because they're talking about a two-way trip, but it's the same idea. And the 15-minute city, as I mentioned, proposed by Carlos Moreno, and this has been sort of adopted as a philosophy in Paris, although of course most people don't actually live and work within 15 minutes of each other, even in Paris. And it's this nouveau chrono-urbanism, which is, sort of, I like chrono-urbanism as a concept, and la ville de court d'air, when I'm butchering the French, but this has sparked surprising amount of controversy. I mean, there have been protests against the 15-minute city, and this especially popped up after lockdowns with COVID because people thought or wanted to pretend to think, I don't know how many people believed it as opposed to pretending to believe it, that the 15-minute city idea was not that you could do things within 15 minutes, but that you must do things within 15 minutes. And with lockdown, of course, governments made people stay within their 15-minute area or or the local government area. Restrictions vary depending on where you are. And people have protested against this. And it's the are they really against this idea? I mean, do they not want to be able to reach things within 15 minutes? I don't think that they would say that if you put it to them that way, but they don't want to be bound to be within 15 minutes, which is understandable, but that's not actually what's being proposed. And I've even gotten dragged into this by something that purports to be a newspaper in Washington, D.C., where they were describing the 30-minute city as dystopian, which is a little bit odd. But so goes the media. So I think that we do want to create a world where people can reach more things in less time. Okay, not that they have to go to the things that are nearest them, but that they can have more things that are closer to them. So how do we achieve that? The first thing is talking about job housing balance. And so I showed you the accessibility map for Sydney, and this is access to jobs. But if we look at the distribution, the ratio of jobs to workers, we can see that there's a lot more jobs in the eastern part of Sydney and a lot more workers in the western part of Sydney. And so there's an imbalance. So if we look at the ratio of jobs to worker accessibility, right, how many jobs can you reach divided by how many workers you can reach, we see that the city is asymmetric, and sort of ignore the low populated areas in the Blue Mountains. The CBD has a very high job to worker ratio, above 1.8, and Western Sydney is below 0.5. So what can we do about that? And why should we do something about that? Well, it turns out that there aren't a lot of free lunches in this world, but there are a few. And one free lunch is that adding jobs and housing in the right places reduces total emissions and total amount of travel. So if we start off with a world where all of the jobs are in A and all of the workers live in B, everyone has to commute from B to A. Depending on how far apart they are, let's say they're 2 kilometers apart, then the total daily travel from home to work is 2,000 person kilometers per day. If we add 500 workers to A and we add 500 jobs to B, the total daily travel reduces because some of the people who previously were commuting the whole distance don't have to, and instead are able to live where they work or work where they live. And this is using a gravity model. You could do any kind of model and you'd see that the total daily travel to work would be reduced. And assuming that we're going to have these extra people anyway, right? Our transport policies don't cause additional childbirth, and they might cause migration within the metro area, but they're probably not causing a lot of migration between metro areas. And even so, it's the same idea between these metro areas. We can get less total travel if we balance jobs and housing. There's a lot of strategies that can be done. Sydney is trying to develop the Aerotropolis, the Western Sydney Airport. It has moved some government offices out of the CBD, administrative offices, but it could actually move the seat of government and all of the hangers-on as a more, as to provide greater symbolism for this, but also all of the workers who deal directly with Parliament, and not just in the private sector, public sector, but also in the private sector, would move along with them. And similarly, you can put more housing in the east. And so the Green Square development, as shown here, is an example of that, but there is a lot more that could be done. A lot of that requires confronting existing residential development, places that have already had existing residential development, and developing them at higher densities. And the residents are not often thrilled by the prospect, but that's the conflict that you have to have. So the idea of neighborhood livability and global sustainability are in conflict, and we just need to recognize that. Another thing that we can look at is street space allocation. So imagine we have a road that's 3 lanes in one direction. We've got 2 lanes for moving cars and 1 lane for storing cars. Okay, that's not the most efficient use of public space. We would get a lot more people through the system if we dedicated a lane for moving bicycles and a lane for public transport, and we could solve some of other problems by transforming some of that space into green space, planting more trees in the city, providing more canopy, and the like. Obviously, the where you do this is going to affect the exact street space reallocation you should do, but it's certainly a feasible thing. And an example here, just sort of changing a high-speed curve before and after. This lowers the speed. It makes it better for people who are walking, and probably a little bit less convenient in terms of time for people who are driving, although probably safer for people who are driving. And we have a lot of places where treatments, this is just one example, like this could be done. And we have seen this done. And Amsterdam is the poster child for road space reallocation. And the top is what Amsterdam looked like a little over 50 years ago. And the bottom is basically what it looks like today on the same site. We have examples of that in Sydney and other cities in Australia. The top is what George Street at the QVB looked like in 1920. The bottom is what it looked like in 1958. And now what it looked like in 2019 when the light rail opened. All right. So there are things that can be done, and they can be done in more places. We could be looking at how do we can increase train use. And there's a lot of things that we can do to increase train use and make train more convenient. This is looking at train area catchments. Okay, so we can look at access to train stations, right, instead of access to jobs. And here we look at how many, purple is within a 5-minute walk, green is within a 10-minute walk, and 15 is within a 15-minute walk for Sydney. And this map isn't surprising. It's a more precise map than they would have drawn in 1923 because we have GIS and we can do network analysis and so on. And if you look at a number of the train stations, entrances have been closed over time. So this is Epping, then and now. And so if you wanted to go to that street now, you would have a more circuitous route than you did back in, I'm guessing, the 1930s when this shot was originally taken. So let me illustrate it with a cartoon. In the lower left, you'll see a lady coming out of her apartment building who has to walk to a single entrance at one end of the platform. The gates are at one end to catch a train. And so she walks, she waits, the train comes, drops her at her exit, and then she has to walk again across the entire platform to get to her place of work. She's got 6 minutes of extra walking just because of the location of the entrances of the train station and where she lives. And that's in the morning. She has another 6 minutes in the evening. That's 12 minutes a day. This is not an inconsiderable amount of time. Now we can improve this by putting entrances on both sides of the station. So she now has only a 2-minute walk to position herself on the platform so that when she gets to her destination, she doesn't have to walk too far to her job in the factory. And of course, if she lived on the right side of the station, which is up to her and up to developers, she could be even more efficient about it and just have to walk down the staircase and wait there. Now, this is obviously saves time for people and will increase their likelihood of using public transport. We want to ensure gates that are on each end of the platform, particularly when there is currently a gate on only one end of the platform. And we can look at the distribution of different additional travel times, but it's not a small amount of time. But it's also better for the system as a whole because we know that people cluster around the staircases and escalators, and they'll just come down the escalator and tend to stay there. Not everybody, not transport analysts who are optimizing the system and will walk exactly to the doors that will be where they need to be when they exit the station because they know the configuration of every station on the system and know where the escalators are on their exiting station. Most people don't think about that too deeply. They'll just stop and wait for the train and then work it out when they get there. There have been some remediations in the Sydney Trains network. All right, so this is the schematic at Redfern Station. So when I first did this slide, it was supposed to open in 2021. In the event, it opened in 2023 for reasons. And you can see that this makes it a lot better. And the interesting thing, of course, is that there were staircases on all of these platforms and an overpass to connect towards the University of Sydney until 1995, and they took it down for safety reasons, but they didn't replace it until 2023. We could be doing better than that. And from an accessibility perspective, this means that more people are within a 5-minute walk of any given platform, right? And we can look at the increase in the number of people who are within 5 minutes and 10 minutes and 15 minutes of their population and jobs. And that is a huge predictor of transit ridership. Erskineville Station, which is the one that they've also recently remediated, is the station which has the most impact by putting the station entrances on both sides. And this is because a lot of development has occurred southeast of that station, and since the station, since long after the station was originally developed. And so we're seeing an 89% of the number of people who are within a 5-minute walk of the station now. And over the long run, that's going to increase station utilization. And there's 44 stations, or there were 44 stations on the Sydney network that had entrances only on one end, not even in the middle, just at one end of the platform, that this kind of treatment could help. There's things we can do with traffic signals, right? So traffic signals are designed, timed using the SCAT system in Australia, Sydney Coordinated Adaptive Traffic Signals. And the idea is to minimize delay for automobiles, which it does fairly admirably. And nevertheless, if you arrive, at a red light, you're likely to have some delay. On average, 1/2 of the red time will be how long you wait if you arrive during the red phase of the cycle. And then if you arrive during the green phase, of course, you're not waiting. So we can measure an average vehicle delay. The problem with the pedestrian arriving in a normal cycle is that you can't give the pedestrian as much time to as you can for an automobile, because pedestrians move slower than cars, and you want to make sure that they've cleared before the conflicting movements in the orthogonal direction have begun. So we tend to give them less time automatically, and there's more time for not only flashing don't walk, but a solid don't walk signal. And so they're going to have more delay. But with an adaptive signal control system, it's even worse, because you don't know when the light's going to change. So you have to get the pedestrians cleared from the intersection before the light might change, even if it doesn't. And so often signals are timed to give pedestrians the minimum amount of time available, which would be 6 seconds, rather than the maximal amount of time available, because you don't know what the maximal amount of time is. And it could be that the maximal amount of time that you can safely give them is also 6 seconds if no other cars are at the intersection, because it's not a fixed time signal. So wrote an article about this that appeared in the Conversation a few years ago. We can measure the amount of time this works out for a network, and pedestrians will tend to have to wait at most intersections when they're moving through a city. And it works out that between 20 and 30% of the time of a pedestrian moving through a city is waiting at a traffic light. Now, 20% is not just a 20% accessibility loss, it's closer to a 50% accessibility loss. So 24% delay due to signals means that a pedestrian can reach in 30 minutes today what they could reach in 22 minutes 100 years ago, before traffic signals were widely deployed. And you all remember that the area that can be covered increases with the square of the radius. So that distance, their potential accessibility has been greatly reduced by nearly half, because of this type of traffic signal delay. So there's a number of things that we can do. Okay, we don't want pedestrians to have to push a button, because if you're just a fraction of a second late in pushing the button, then you have to wait a full cycle. This should be automatic. Pedestrians should be counted, and this should be considered in the delay algorithms. And they should be prioritized in the traffic signal delay algorithms, because they're out there in the elements, while people in cars are generally in air-conditioned comfort. Pedestrians should get the maximum feasible amount of time, green time on a phase. They should get a leading interval so they can move out into the intersection before turning cars are moving, so the cars will see them. And there should be all pedestrian phases. Okay. So the ideas that I talked about, they're sort of called lowercase design compared to like what architects or starchitects would like to do. We're designing a 30-minute city that in 30-minute aligns with travel time budgets and human behavior. This is something that people have understood for probably at least 200 years, since people have started developing rail systems in Sydney since the 1850s, in the UK since the 1830s. They were keyed in on the idea of people want to be able to get to their destination in not too much time. We want to be able to develop land, and we have to space stations appropriately. 30 minutes is a reasonable threshold to be thinking about when we're looking at how to optimize the city. There's a lot of things that we can be looking at. We can be looking at station entrances. Okay, so talked about station entrances, so they're both sides of the platform to minimize the amount of time that people have to semi-circumnavigate the station. But we could also look at it, where are the bus stops at the station relative to the station entrance? People often have to walk 1 or 2 blocks away to transfer from a train to a bus. If you're used to it, that's fine. If you're a new traveler, this is very discouraging, and might wind up going the wrong direction, and you go to a bus stop and it's not the right bus, so you have to wait another 15 minutes to get to the right bus stop where this bus actually stops. Leaving aside if you have any kinds of disabilities, cognitive difficulties, vision problems, English isn't your first language, there's a lot of issues associated with how we design around the stations. It's not big, grandiose design issues, but they're really important. Where we put stops and their locations and how far apart they are from each other. Whether we allow all-door boarding at stops. This would speed up the boarding process. We could have prepayment at most, if not all, bus stops so that people can tap on before they board the bus. People tend to board the bus in the front at almost all stations, at almost all bus stops, except a few in the CBD where they're instructed otherwise. And they do this because people used to pay the driver. People haven't paid the driver in more than a decade. Why are they still have to board at the front? The driver isn't even enforcing fare payments anymore. There's a lot of things we could do to improve timetables and frequencies, all of which are aimed at making public transport operate more effectively. And we need to rethink transport and land use balance. So we have a huge imbalance today, and we can offset today's imbalance and allow additional growth without having additional traffic or additional congestion. And so this involves putting jobs in housing-rich areas and housing in a job-rich area systematically rather than just opportunistically. Now, I talk a little bit about nihilism and say that cities are pointless. And what I mean is not that we shouldn't have cities, but that the way we think about cities when we're master planners is that we think of a station as a point rather than a place. And we think of an intersection junction as a point, and when in reality, it's a space. Now, anyone who's doing a station design thinks of it as a place, but then they draw a small boundary around the station and say, well, we've gotten people outside the station, our job is done. So we have this mismatch between the master planners who view the station as a point and the engineers and architects designing the facility itself who don't look at the outside world very deeply. And we have the same problem at intersections with traffic engineers. And you hear, so no one cares about 5 seconds. And I mean, it's not really true, but even if it were true, you couldn't get to a 10-second savings unless you got to a 5-second savings, and you couldn't save 10 minutes unless you save 5 minutes. You have to be adding these things up because you're not doing everything simultaneously. We do not have Zeno's paradox here. So we think about our engineer. I'm an engineer. We're trained to do it right. We're trained how to calculate things. And we think about planners, and ideally planners are trained, we should do the right thing. But our general public is going to say, you should do the right thing right. You need to think about your strategy and your tactics, your idea and your implementation. You can't just say, hand it off and not worry about the integration of those things, which means that we really need to think about how we've defined our professions. And we really don't want a profession of urban planners or traffic engineers, but we want urban operators. So the problem with urban planners is they're thinking too far into the future, and they're not thinking about directly how to reconfigure the city of today. So if we had urban operators who were engaged in the existing city, not the future city, and how to optimize where we're at. And we need people who are transportists, not just transport planners or transport engineers or transport economists or geographers. So this urban operations profession would fuse planning and engineering ideas, solving today's problems in real time, like how can we create more accessibility today, with the existing resources, rather than aiming at long-term or imagined problems. So we want to bridge or merge the soft and hard, right? We want the policy and the pricing and the management and control, along with the engineering, the concrete, and even the electronics, so that we can systematically improve the transport land use system, the cities that we live in. And so we should identify as transportists rather than identifying as engineers or planners. And with that said, I mean, the problem must come before the solution. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I really want to. We haven't got any particular questions in the chat as of now. We just give it a second while people prepare the questions. I mean, I have this obvious one, which is probably one that you get a lot in terms of how does a COVID event and home office feed into all of this? And because what we now have is we have the workplace in your home, which doesn't actually require commute at all, or reduces it to once or twice a week. You know, this is so I'll just curious to hear your opinion on
Sure.
that.
I mean, a, a fundamental mistake that anybody who's sort of in office work and as a transport planner makes is assuming that most workers are like themselves. And this has been a problem that we've had for 70 years. So transport planners, urban planners worked in office buildings in the city. And so they designed transport systems to enable people who worked in office buildings in the city to get there conveniently, which I mean is understandable, but not good. Right. And now, oh, I don't go into work but 1 day a week or 2 days a week. So that must be true for everybody. And it's not true for everybody. I mean, it's true for some people. It's true for a lot of people in this particular kind of crowd. But it's not true for everybody. So most people don't have jobs that allow telecommuting. And the people who can telecommute don't telecommute 5 days a week. So certainly the CBD has lost importance relative to where it was pre-2020. And this has affected public transit most significantly of all of the modes, because that was a mode that was designed precisely to get large numbers of people into the CBD, which is dominated by office workers. But that doesn't mean we don't still have people who are going to work and that the work trip still isn't the major trip in most people's lives. The other thing to keep in mind is, okay, that's of workers. Half of the people don't work. Children who don't work, you have retirees who don't work, you have stay-at-home parents who don't work, you have unemployed people who don't work, disabled people who don't work, and so on. That's half the population. They never were centered on this, but there were members of households often where somebody was centered on this. So it was still an important aspect of their lives. Now, if the commute to work isn't as important, then people are going to be doing other things with their lives, which means they want access to other things. So the 15-minute neighborhood may become relatively more important in their location decisions than the 30-minute city, because it's more important for them to be able to get to non-work destinations relatively compared to before than to the CBD, because they're only going to the CBD for recreational activities now, not 5 days a week, maybe it's only 2 days a week. Another thing to keep in mind is of people who work and of people even who work in offices, most of them still don't work in the CBD. And never worked in the CBD. So depending on how you define the CBD, it was 15 to 20% of the workforce. So maybe 40% of the office-based workforce, not even 50% of the office-based workforce in a metro area like Sydney.
Thanks, David. The Lindsay put into the chat, excellent, refreshing presentation. Thanks, David. And follows up with a question: how does one use the concept to address risk and uncertainty in transport and land use?
Yeah, so there's a lot of aspects to that. I'm not sure I'm thinking of the same aspects of risk and uncertainty that Lindsay is. One is we cannot accurately forecast the future. Right? We just sort of need to accept that. And if one cannot do something, one probably shouldn't really spend a lot of effort trying to do that. I mean, we should accept that as an impossibility rather than as something that, oh, if we just threw more resources at it, we'd get a better answer. So the question is, how do we design for adaptability and flexibility? And one of the reasons I like accessibility as a concept rather than congestion measures or some of these other things is that we're not concerned about which specific trips people from a specific house are making and going to. We're providing a service that allows people to do what they want within the urban system. So it provides for a more flexible approach. And so we're giving people options rather than trying to optimize for a particular facility. But there's always uncertainty about the future. But most of the roads that we will have in 10 years are here today. Most of the buildings that we will have in 10 years are here today. And we know we have a lot of problems today. How can we solve those problems today? So let's focus on more short run types of things that will have faster payoffs rather than spending resources disproportionately spending resources to worry about problems that don't exist yet. And I think we've gone too far over towards building metro lines into greenfields type of activities.
Thanks, David. Mindful of time as well. There's a comment from David Nash, maybe as a short response to that. Your criticism of signals for pets is somewhere overstated. In Melbourne, we make extensive use of walk extension, auto introduction, and late introduction. There's no remedy for pets being slower than cars. All pet phases almost always increase pet delays.
I'm in Sydney and he's in Melbourne, and Melbourne probably does a better job than Sydney does in this regard. I'll start with that.
Yes.
The second thing I will say is, yes, pedestrians are always slower than cars. The third thing I will say is we shouldn't be designing traffic signals to make it easier to drive into cities, right? That's not the right objective. And it's pitched as a safety device, but it's really a convenience device. And that's, I think, sort of where some of the mismatch is. Whether pedestrian scramble phases always increase pedestrian delays, I think in part that depends on where you are and whether you also, if you do only pedestrian scrambles and don't also have the regular phases, it's different than if you have both. But if I want to cross two streets, I don't want to have to wait at two traffic lights, and that's the beauty of a pedestrian scramble. So I think it depends on context. I'm not advocating it everywhere. I think it's just something that we need to keep in mind.
Yes, there has been talk about a fast link train between Wollongong and Sydney for forever as well since I've arrived here, and I don't think I'm going to see it in my lifetime. But that's just an off topic, another headache in terms of transportation planning and how slowly we move in this country. Lindsay has another question. I'll make this the last one because I'm mindful of time. The presentation highlights the merits of adopting the triple axis planning in scenario and other planning. Agreed. How does the concept account for travel behavior differences in households? Just let you know that this is the last question we're going to cover today.
In terms of differences in households, every household is going to have different travel behavior, and households today are going to have different travel behavior than households in 5 and 10 years. And it's not our job to know or predict what that is. It's our job to provide choices so that people can do lots of different things. And so in terms of training and transport planning professionals, I think we should be looking more at breaking down disciplinary barriers. I think we should be looking at enabling people to be or encouraging people to have both planning and engineering training rather than just having one when they're dealing in this field. At a minimum, even if most of your work tends towards one side or the other, being able to communicate and understand what the other side is talking about is useful. And thinking about the values that are embedded in the kinds of decisions that are nominally engineering decisions, but they're really pretty value laden, I think is important, and a lot of people don't get. And then institutional barriers. And the idea of having multimodal departments for transport is a great idea. And I know a number of the states are moving towards that, but they're moving towards that more in form than in practice. And I think there's still a lot of barriers within the organizations, and it doesn't help, at least in the New South Wales case, that you have 4 different transport ministers. I think people need to be sort of looking at it from a bigger picture.
Yes, thanks, David.
Thank you.
It was a great presentation. I think you're naturally very good at this. Like you haven't lost the audience at all, and I really truly enjoyed the conversation. As of a closure today, a round of applause for David, please, virtually or in whatever mode. Thanks so much for coming. I would like to encourage our visitors today, our guests today, to follow CIRT Australia, because we have more of these events coming. We do want to talk to the industry and help translate and engage in more talks like this as continuous learning for all of us. So if you enjoyed today's event or not, or if you have any constructive feedback for us, please fill out the survey or provide feedback directly to Academy Global, who's hosting a lot of these events for us here at the Chartered Institute. And yeah, please stay connected in any shape or form. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, the New South Wales section of CIRTA in particular, because we're really active in facilitating these conversations. And if you want to propose a topic of interest, you can do that too. Thank you very much, David, and all our participants, and hope to see you soon again. Bye for now.
Thank you.